Can plants feel what is happening around themselves and work as communities exchanging communications?
Well, I came to biology through a back door because as an anthropologist I was working in the Amazon with indigenous people who consider that plants and animals have intelligence. Well, this led me to try to understand what these people were talking about, and I was born into rationalism, materialism, and humanism. And I came to see a striking series of correspondences between what shamans perceive in their visions and what molecular biologists have started to pick up on in their labs over the last 50 years. Indigenous people say that there are essences that are common to all life forms and that are the sources of information that they receive in their trances. Well, since 1953, science has put its finger on a molecule called DNA, which is present in each cell of each living being and which is a source of information. So the animist point of view that there are essences common to all life forms that animate them is confirmed by molecular biology. The very shape of the DNA molecule, which is two complementary strands wrapped around each other, the double helix shape, shows up in images painted by shamans on 5 continents for millennia in the form of the axis mundi. I invite you to read Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism, printed in 1951, in which he documents this exhaustively. The axis mundi being the shape with which shamans around the world associate the essences or spirits that animate the different life forms. So shamans have identified, long before biologists, the central importance of this form for life. These are some of the correspondences between these two domains that have until now been a priori separated. I put this into a book published 11 years ago now in French called The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. But despite these convergences, there continues to be a separation between the two domains because indigenous shamans are attributing intelligence and intention to other species, whereas up until recently, Western science has tended to consider other species as devoid of intention. This is even its central method, if one is to believe Jacques Monod in his book Chance and Necessity. The postulate of the objectivity of nature is to presuppose that there is no intention anywhere in nature. That is the cold gaze of science. And it starts with Descartes, who put down on paper that animals are machines. They don't feel pain even. So there seemed to be a fundamental difference between these two ways of approaching the living world. But I try to work on my own presuppositions, and I know that I'm a Westerner and that I tend to dichotomize. This is how we know. We separate things to understand them. That's the power of rationalism and reductionism. Well, maybe indigenous knowledge and science are not all that separate. Maybe science is changing. I've been reading scientific journals like Nature, Scientific American, La Recherche for 11 years now, and I can say that it's easier to make sense of Amazonian tribes than it is to make sense of molecular biologists. But what about plants? Plants lack brains entirely. I started looking into what science currently says about plant intelligence, and in 2002 found an article in the journal Nature by a biologist called Anthony Trewavas stating that the study of plant intelligence was becoming a serious scientific endeavor, and that plants have intentions, calculate complex aspects of their environment, and make correct decisions. In early 2003, I traveled to Edinburgh to interview Anthony Trewavas, and he explained that the molecular biology of the 1990s had revealed the receptors and the signals used by plant cells as they communicate and learn. Plants can assimilate information on the whole plant level, calculate complex decisions, and act intelligently. It turns out that what they've learned about the signals that plant cells send one another is that in some cases they are identical to the signals, the molecules that our own neurons send one another as we think. So plants do not have brains so much as act like them. The whole plant is like a brain. It is made of cells like our own brain, and they send one another signals which are the same as the signals our own brains use. Just being a plant, sending down roots in a branching structure and deploying leaves in a way to gather a maximum amount of light, involves integrating a wide range of variables, computing the correct decision, and then enacting them and embodying them. The Amazonian stilt palm is a good example of this. This is a tree that stands on prop roots. It has roots that come out of the ground. And what it does is perceive where the most sunlight is, allow the roots on the shady side to die off, and it grows new roots on the sunny side. And so over a period of several months, at a speed imperceptible to human beings, this tree actually moves, fending off its competitors, and foraging for a maximum amount of light. This is a tree that walks, looking for its place in the sun. Truavas called this a clear example of avoidance action and, intentional behavior by a plant. A clear example of plant intelligence. But what is intelligence? In its original meaning, the word comes from the Latin interlegere, which means to choose between, and implies the capacity to make decisions. But if you look in dictionaries under intelligence, you will find that it has often been defined in exclusively human terms, and by definition cannot apply to other species. It is that which Western cultures have separated ourselves from nature. They said, we are the only intelligent species. It is our treasure. The human specificity is to be intelligent. Everybody else is stupid. So this is our most precious thing. And as such, it has been fought over in terms of just how to define it. There have been so many different definitions of intelligence. This was made particularly clear to me in Japan. In the summer of 2003, I traveled to Hokkaido to speak with Toshiyuki Nakagaki, a biologist who had just demonstrated that single-celled slime molds can solve mazes. Slime molds are special organisms because they usually behave like a glistening mass of mucus that swarms over and engulfs its food. Not exactly a prime candidate for intellectual achievement. It is a single cell that can grow as big as a human hand, and if you cut it into pieces, it can also rejoin and form a single cell. Well, Nakagaki and his colleagues published their results in the journal Nature because what they showed was that when you put a slime mold into a maze, it actually reduces its body down to form a tube spanning the shortest distance between the entrance and the exit at which they'd placed food. So it solved the maze, finding the shortest path each time it was tested. Just how it does this is not known. By what mechanism this single cell computes the shortest path is actually being investigated now. Nevertheless, the results are there. And they used the word intelligence in their article. Nakagaki told me that in the media attention that ensued, there had been two main reactions. Japanese reporters were mainly concerned with the details of just how such an organism had solved the maze, whereas Western reporters mainly questioned whether this phenomenon constituted intelligence or not. He attributed the difference to the animist background of Japanese culture and to the Japanese word for intelligence, which is chi-sei, chi meaning to know and sei meaning capacity of or property of. Many Japanese people do not hesitate to attribute a capacity to know to other life forms, including single-celled slime. I asked Nakagaki how he had dealt with the dilemma involving intelligence and Westerners. He said that he had noticed, subsequently to having published his article, that when he used the word smartness to refer to the slime mold's behavior, Westerners agreed. And so since then, he only used the word smartness, which is pretty smart. But in its original meaning, the word smart refers to elegance, tidiness, and cleanliness, and is not that pertinent to intelligence in nature. Even nature is a tricky concept. it is usually defined as the phenomena of the physical world to the exclusion of human beings and human creations. The idea of nature includes a separation between ourselves and other species. And actually, if one is strict with words, intelligence in nature is a contradiction in terms, because intelligence excludes non-humans and nature excludes humans. But this shows that our concepts that disengage us from other species hamper our thinking. We have trouble with words when the slime mold solves the maze because our concepts don't fit the data. It's not so much that nature lacks intelligence, but that our own concepts do.
The invisible world. How do we really perceive nature? Can plants, animals, and other life forms use means of communication beyond our perception? Is our life viable without these forms of plant communication? Is it possible for us to replicate these kinds of interactivity that are found in nature? What are the processes that plants use to communicate?
There is an electrode here in connection with the leaves. I changed the position of the electrode. And another electrode is in contact with the roots. So the sound here that can be produced by the plant is by creating a difference of potential, of electric potential. She's creating the signal that is making the music now. It is the plant changing the notes, the melody, the rhythm. So you see, if I detach the electrode, the plant will not sing anymore. This was an experimentation in Damanhur since 30 years to see if plants are intelligent beings.
Is the plant reacting on her own music that she's producing?
Yes, she is.
Okay.
Plants like music and they like their own music. So, as more as they play and they listen to music, as happier they
And
are.
joyful
As more they play.
But what about sound? The Desmodium gyrans is commonly known as the dancing plant, in the strict sense of the word.
If you make a noise, you'll see the leaves of this plant move incessantly. But you know, if you touch it instead of making a sound, it doesn't move at all. Actually, it's sound that it's sensitive to.
They like people to sing a song to them. They like to hear the nicely speech from the people, not from the artificial sound, like from electronic sound. They like to play with human.
So for us scientists, this is a great problem. For two reasons. Firstly, because we don't know how it works. Secondly, and this is perhaps worse, we don't know what it's for. I find this very curious. a plant that makes itself noticed by moving. A predator, a herbivore, a deer, or a horse would see it more if it moved rather than not moving. So there is a real mystery surrounding this plant.
It's the unique vineyard of one man, his plants, and his music. Organic wine grower Jean-Marie Zerre doesn't use fertilizers. He's convinced that what helps his grapes grow is a daily dose of the classics.
At first, everyone thought I was a little bit crazy. Some still do. But it's been my experience that the taste and aroma are better, and the sugar levels rise.
Jean-Marie seems in total harmony with his harvest. He even has music composed especially for his plants. His work raises a huge question. Can plants hear? Two German students hope to find out, with the help of the scientist's old friend, the tomato plant. The plants are placed in separate rooms and kept under exactly the same conditions, except one. One group gets its very own sound system. For 2 hours a day, they are blasted with classical music, whether they like it or not. Their neighbors are left in peace. Apart from the music, daily life for both sets of plants is exactly the same. The students measure the plants each day. 15 days later, it's time to test the results. The blue bars show the growth of the plants in the music room. The plants exposed to music are a little bit ahead of the others. The results are too close to prove anything, but it's an exciting step toward discovering if plants really do respond to sound.
The invisible alchemy. Do these incredible plant vibrations interfere with the chemical processes involved in maintaining the balance of nature? Could these vibrations be compared with the human heartbeat as it changes with stress, happiness, sleep, and exercise? Does other communication occur inside the soil, and could this communication be vital for the rest of life on Earth? Can plants feel what is happening around themselves and work as communities exchanging communication?
Thank you, everyone, to be here. Okay, let's start immediately because we have not too much time. And I will show you now 4 slides in a very fast sequence. This one, this one, this one, and the last one. It's a very easy psychological test we did some years ago to the university student. We asked to this university student to tell us what they saw in the slides. And the 96% of the people interviewed tell us that they saw just deers, elks, frogs, and for the last slide, 98% of the people will tell you that there is an adult man and a young girl. Well, all these slides have in common the fact that 80% of the slides is made by plant, but our brain is filtering out all this stuff about plant. And it's a well-known feature of our brain. It's called the plant blindness. Is the inability to see or notice the plants in the environment. It's a kind of tool for, that protect our brain to be overloaded with a lot of information about this green stuff. We evolved in a forest, and it was much more important for us to be aware of animals, of other humans, and not to be overloaded with all this information about green. Well, this was a nice tool at the beginning of our evolution, but today it's a problem. Today, this plant blindness prevents us, for example, to know this data. This is the unbelievable data. 99.7% of the biomass of the planet is made by plants. So everything that I would say that the life of the planet, it's a green life. All the animals, all together, human included, is just 0.3%. So it's unbelievable that we don't know actually how these plants works, and we are all the time underestimating their amazing abilities. Well, let's have a look at the beginning how a plant is made. A plant is a sessile organism. Sessile means that it cannot move. The plants cannot move from one place to the other, but they can move a lot. And the second point is that plants have no organs. This is an unbelievable difference with the animals. So I mean, animals concentrate specific functions inside specific organs. So we have eyes to see, we have lung for breathing, we have the stomach to digest, and so on. But the plants evolved not to have any organs, because having an organ is too dangerous for plants that have to be predated, to be eaten by animals. So you can imagine that it's not a single insect just eating a little bit of your brain would be enough to kill you, no? And so this is why the plants have no organs. But having no organs doesn't mean that they have no function. This is an important point. In other words, plants are able to see without eyes, they are able to hear without hearing, they are able to taste and to smell and to breathe without the organs, and they are also able to make calculation, memorize, learning without brain. Now the point about plant is that they cannot move, but actually they move a lot. There are passive movement in plants, like in this pine cone, the opening and the closing of a pine cone that has been used for the production of new passive materials, or is a very nice Erodium secutarium. This is a seeds that you can see just with change in the humidity it's turning, and use this ability to enter in the soil. And so it's like a spermatozoa. It works very well, and you can see that at the end some of them are also able to enter in the soil. Now what is amazing about that is that they do this without using any energy. So they have no muscles. Look, it was able to enter. So they use no energy, they have no muscles, and it's just the way the material is made that is amazing, that make possible these wonderful movements. Of course, there are active movements. Some of them are very fast, like in the case of the Venus flytrap. Dionea is a carnivorous plant. We know that it's a very fast movement. Many of them can be exhibited just by making a fast, the time lapse, the so-called time lapse technique. And so we can see this graceful movement, like in this case, this is a young bean. It's just 3 hours of time. It's not a week. So the plants move a lot, and we can see here this growing of sunflowers, no? That they grow all together, and even this growing together is important because it's an important moment of their social life. So they are really learning how to stay together during this first phase of their life. And now I would like to put our argumentation a little bit further. can we tell that plants are conscious organisms? So because I'm pretty sure that they are intelligent, I will not discuss with you about that. Plants are intelligent and they are able to solve problems, and this is my preferred definition of intelligence. Now the point is, are plants conscious? Consciousness is are plants aware of their position in the environment? So it's a problem to find the right definition about consciousness. It's normally defined by removing something. But Michio Kaku, it's a quite famous physicist. And he wrote recently this book, The Future of Mind. And as a physicist, he gave a definition of consciousness that it's quite understandable.
Consciousness is the number of feedback loops required to create a model of your position in space with relationship to other organisms, and finally in relationship to time.
So the consciousness is just your ability to build a model of yourself in relation to the space, to the other organism, and to the time. Are plants able to do that? Okay, let's have a look. First point.
So think of the consciousness of a thermostat. I believe that even a lowly thermostat has one unit of consciousness. That is, it senses the temperature around it. And then we have a flower. A flower has maybe 10 units of consciousness. It has to understand the temperature, the weather, humidity, where gravity is pointing.
Well, so for Michio Kaku, the sensing, it's the first level of consciousness. So plants are unbelievably more sensitive than animals. A single plant is able to detect at least 20 different chemical and physical parameters all the times. Among them, there are all our common sense, let's say, but also something a little bit strange as electrical gradient, chemical gradient, magnetic fields, and or heavy metals, and so on, pathogens. So we know that plants, for example, are very sensitive to gravity, and as every living organism on the earth, and we can see here a maize growing according to gravity. But well, now that plants are also able to sense vibrations, and so we can see here how the roots of the plants grow toward the source of sound. So they are able to sense the sound, and they are able to grow, and to grow toward the source of the sound. And also, they are able to produce the sound. This kind of click, it's a very amplified sounds of growing roots. This is just in real time, so it's few seconds. A growing root is producing specific sounds that are probably used by the other root apex to have information about the position of the roots in the soil. Well, let's go on to the second point, to the first level of consciousness, space.
And then finally we go to the reptilian brain, which I call level 1 consciousness. And reptiles basically have a very good understanding of their position in space, especially because they have to lunge out and grab prey.
Okay, so reptiles are very well aware of the space. It's the same for the plants. Let's have a look. This is a Cuscuta plant. Cuscuta plant is a parasitic plant that need to find a host in a very short time before dying. And you can see how this plant is immediately directing toward the tomato plant and find it and parasitizing the tomato plant. Well, this is quite trivial. It's just a chemical driving the information to the plant. It's a volatile. But look at this case. This is the same plant that have to take a decision, because it's in the middle between wheat and tomato. And all the time is choosing tomato because tomato is much easier to parasitize. But if there is no tomato, even wheat can work. Okay, and this is something simple. Let's have to see something a little bit more curious. This is a bean in my lab, and this is a support, and you can see that how is moving for reaching the support. So I mean, this plant knows exactly where the support is, where the pole is, and is trying to do all its best for reaching. I don't know if you can see, but the apex of the shoots already made a kind of hook in the right position, even if the plants didn't touch until now the support. And you can see also the movement. It's a wonderful movement. It's just, even in this case, just passive, just based on osmotic actuator. Look at the hook in the apex, and almost. Another try, and it's not enough. And you can almost feel, no, the effort, and look at the leaves now that they reach the support. How is much quiet, calm. Anyway, so we know that the bean is aware of the pole. Okay, there is also something more impressive, because look, in this case I am putting a pole among two beans. So there is the sensing phase. They know that there is a pole. They start to compete. And look, when the first one is winning, the winner, the other one change direction. So this is you can repeat this experiment 100 times, and 100 times you will get the same result. So this means that the second plant is not just aware of the support, is also aware of another organism, of another plants, and is aware of what the other plant is able to do. Okay? Great. Social life.
Then we have level 2 consciousness, the monkey consciousness, the consciousness of emotions, social hierarchies. Where are we in relationship to the tribe?
Okay, I don't want to spend too much time, because the social life of the plant is very well known. And plants are social organisms at any level of their evolution, from Chlamydomonas. This is a single algae, unicellular algae, that shows swarm behavior, so a kind of social movement like the one of the ants. And there's swinging shoots. Look how they oscillate all together. Okay, this seems something very easy to do, but it's not easy at all. You need to be in synchrony with your neighbor to do this, and so you need to be well aware of what the movement of your neighboring is. And keen recognition, it's something unbelievably interesting. So we know today that that plants have different behavior according to the degree of relativeness of the other plants. So normally, for example, beans, the very common bean, are cooperating when they are in the same pot, they are related. But when the two plants are unrelated, they are normally competing. And in a wood, it's a huge networks of plants interacting each other. For example, we know that this is a graph showing that a single tree is linked to 47 different trees, and they use this network for sharing information, for sharing even food and water, nutrients and water. Well, there is much more with plants. We have not too much time to show all the wonderful thing about plants. Plants, for example, are able to memorize. They are able to memorize and to learn. We demonstrate just a few months ago that it's possible to teach a mimosa sensitive plant not to close anymore when there is a non-dangerous stimulus. And this sensitive plant is able to maintain the information for 40 days. So I mean, the memory lasts at least 40 days. That it's a lot. On the average, the memory in insect is just 24 hours. Even for me, 40 days, it's a lot. And so it's amazing to see that plants are able to maintain information so long. And just a last thing. So from my point of view, intelligence and consciousness are real biological phenomenon. So they can be studied as real. They need to be studied as real biological phenomenon. And it's something like reproduction. I mean, there is reproduction, it's completely different in a bacteria, in fungi, and the humans, okay? But there is a common background that means that phenomenon is reproduction. It's the same for intelligence. It's different, but it's always the way the same. Thank you very much.
Okay, but now, you know, these are things where we could say, okay, evolution kind of made them that way and optimized them for this. But you also said things like behavior and learning and memory. You know, it's like,
that's right.
So I can accept that a plant can sense the environment to its advantage, but how could it possibly learn or remember?
That's a good question. And the answer is not entirely clear, how can a plant learn and remember, but it's documented. And so I introduced our guest here, the mimosa plant, earlier. There was a researcher, this was actually just published last year, Dr. Monica Galliano. She is one of the proponents of plant intelligent research. So she took this plant that I mentioned before, how it closes up when it's stimulated, and she dropped it. And she took a bunch of these plants and she set up an experiment where she dropped the plants from a height of 15 centimeters, and I'm sure you can guess what happened the first time they did it.
The plant's going to curl up.
The plant's curled up.
Right.
She kept doing this, and the effort was to habituate the plant to being dropped. This is a technique used in animal research, but it had never been before applied to plants. And so what she did was she kept dropping the plants. And I'm sure that was a really fun day in the lab, dropping the plants again and again. And this is why we have students. But what ended up happening was the plants stopped folding up. They learned that this particular stimulation wasn't going to harm them. They weren't being chomped on. It was just being dropped. They'd become habituated to being dropped.
Well, couldn't it just be that they were worn out, that whatever was...
No, fair enough. I mean, I'd be tired too if I'd been dropped all day. When they were shaken, a different stimulus, still being physically manipulated, but very different from being dropped, they still closed up.
Oh, wow.
So their energy reserves were still intact. They were just choosing to ignore one stimulus, but since they didn't know the other one, they thought it could still be dangerous.
Wow. Okay. So that is kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit. What about? I mean, but animals don't just, you know, sense the environment and react to the environment. They can communicate with one another. They can recognize. You know, like a bear can recognize another bear. Dogs can somehow know that the other thing is a dog and not something else.
Absolutely.
So that. I mean, how do plants match up on that score?
Plants actually have several methods of communications. I mentioned before fungal symbiotes in the roots. There is some evidence that fungal networks between neighboring plants can mediate communication through chemical pathways, so that if one plant is experiencing stress, like drought, the other plant, and this has been shown experimentally, will start to protect itself from an oncoming drought, even though it's still receiving the same amount of water. The mechanism isn't entirely understood, but the effect is still there. Another, and this is a very well-known mechanism in plant science, is airborne chemical communication. So plants, when they're being chomped on by an insect, released a chemical called methyl jasmonate. It's a pheromone, it's found in all plants, and when that's released, it has two effects. It causes the plant that's releasing it to begin changing, to begin preparing chemical defenses against the herbivore. But since it's airborne, its neighbors detect that and start to prepare themselves for a herbivore which may be coming their way eventually. Now, interestingly, this seems to be tied to how closely related the plant is to the plant receiving the chemical signal, how closely related it is to the plant emitting the chemical signal. The response is stronger the more closely related the plant is to the emitter.
Wow.
But other plants can actually eavesdrop on those chemical cues, even distantly related plants, and interpret them. It's almost like, you know, the rude person at the party who keeps eavesdropping on your conversation.
We try to find out whether plants can communicate between themselves with other plants. And one nice example is by the phenomenon we call talking trees. This is not from our own studies, but from other studies from the other laboratories around the world. Trees are stuck in the same place, most of them. Once they are germinated, they are bound to stay there for the rest of their lives, sometimes for hundreds of years. They cannot run away, and this is making their life very difficult because there are very many creatures who are out to get them. Many insects, mammals, and other creatures can simply come and bite their heads off if they wouldn't do anything good about it. And one way, there are many ways the plants defend themselves against this munching, but one way is to put out or to accumulate all kinds of nasty chemicals. Once they have the chemicals, they deter some of those grazers, herbivores, all kinds of animals that want to munch on them. And in fact, they do something else too. Once there is some munching on a plant, some plants are capable of putting out all kinds of odors, volatile materials, which become airborne and be picked up by other parts of the same plant and other nearby neighbors, which only when they get this message, this communication from another plant, start to produce toxins which deter any attack by insects in this case. This is pretty sophisticated behavior for brainless creatures, I would say.
And if you find it hard to believe that plants can call in insect mercenaries, Baldwin has proof. In one experiment, he captured the chemical signals released by the leaves of plants that were under attack. Then he glued caterpillar eggs onto a leaf, smeared them with the chemical scent, and waited to see if anyone would show up. Within a matter of hours, this insect has responded to the plant's call for help. It's called the big-eyed bug, a pint-sized predator that devours eggs and larvae alike. In fact, it's even been known to take a bite out of a full-size caterpillar. But wait a minute. How does the plant even know who's attacking it, let alone which predator to call in? Well, the answer lies in yet another chemical message. This one delivered by the caterpillar itself.
When the caterpillar chews on a plant, it has to have saliva in its mouth. And in that saliva, there are these various compounds that provide information to the plant, and the plant uses those compounds to say, it is the hawk moth and not a negro bug that's feeding on me. And so it adjusts and tunes its responses to that particular herbivore.
And Baldwin has discovered that this plant has another secret weapon, specifically designed to rid itself of caterpillars. This is a trichome, a sweet little treat deposited by the plant and irresistible to caterpillars. Beautiful, yes, but it's as lethal as a landmine. When this little guy chows down on a trichome, it gets a very bad case of body odor.
20 minutes after eating a trichome, they're smelling. So what we've learned from these particular smells is that they inform predators, particularly ground foraging predators. The plant is offering this nice little sugary first meal for the caterpillars, but it's an evil lollipop because the caterpillar gets tagged for predation. Plants, after all, can't run away, so they have to do this. They have to be able to solve their environmental problems by changing the organism that they are.
And being able to change who they are is critical to the tobacco plant's survival. Because it turns out that the mother of these voracious caterpillars is also the plant's best friend. Its main pollinator, the hawk moth. Of the ground.
I feel when I'm walking through the forest that I'm gliding past an iceberg, because what I am seeing is just the tip of what's going on. What we see above ground is just such a small fraction of the body of the ecosystem. In a lot of ecosystems, over 2/3 of what you see is actually below ground. We're seeing 1/3 of the body of the forest. We think of them as these individuals that are just competing against each other. You know, I'm going to get this and I'm going to get it and you're not going to get it. And that's really led a lot of the thinking, and we've long ignored, you know, a lot of the other interactions other than competition. But at the same time, there's a community effect that we haven't understood, and we're just starting to really look at this and understand that this is a system. It's not just a bunch of individuals competing against each other. They're working together to make this system work.
Yes, trees are the foundation of forests, but a forest is much more than what you see. And today, I want to change the way you think about forests. You see, underground there is this other world, a world of infinite biological pathways that connect trees and allow them to communicate, and allow the forest to behave as though it's a single organism. It might remind you of a sort of intelligence. So how do we do science in complex systems like forests? Well, as forest scientists, we have to do our research in the forest, and that's really tough, as I've shown you. But mostly we have to persevere in spite of all the stuff stacked against us. And we have to follow our intuition and our experiences and ask really good questions. And then we got to gather our data and then go verify. For me, I've conducted and published hundreds of experiments in the forest. Some of my oldest experimental plantations are now over 30 years old. You can check them out. That's how forest science works. So now I want to talk about the science. How were paper birch and Douglas fir communicating? Well, it turns out they were conversing not only in the language of carbon, but also nitrogen and phosphorus and water and defense signals and allelochemicals and hormones, information. And you know, I have to tell you, before me, scientists have thought that this below-ground mutualistic symbiosis called a mycorrhiza was involved. Mycorrhiza literally means fungus root. You see their reproductive organs when you walk through the forest. They're the mushrooms. The mushrooms, though, are just the tip of the iceberg, because coming out of those stems are fungal threads that form a mycelium, and that mycelium infects and colonizes the roots of all the trees and plants. And where the fungal cells interact with the root cells, there's a trade of carbon for nutrients. And that fungus gets those nutrients by growing through the soil and coating every soil particle. The web is so dense that there can be hundreds of kilometers of mycelium under a single footstep. And not only that, that mycelium connects different individuals in the forest. Individuals not only of the same species, but between species, like birch and fir. And it works kind of like the internet. You see, like all networks, mycorrhizal networks have nodes and links. We made this map by examining the short sequences of DNA of every tree and every fungal individual in a patch of Douglas fir forest. In this picture, the circles represent the Douglas fir, or the nodes, and the lines represent the interlinking fungal highways, or the links. The biggest, darkest nodes are the busiest nodes. We call those hub trees, or more fondly, mother trees, because it turns out that those hub trees nurture their young. the ones growing in the understory. And if you can see those yellow dots, those are the young seedlings that have established within the network of the old mother trees. In a single forest, a mother tree can be connected to hundreds of other trees. And using our isotope tracers, we have found that mother trees will send their excess carbon through the mycorrhizal network to the understory seedlings. And we've associated this with increased seedling survival by 4 times. Now, we know we all favor our own children. And I wondered, could Douglas fir recognize its own kin? Like Mama Grizzly and her cub? So we set about an experiment, and we grew mother trees with kin and stranger seedlings. And it turns out they do recognize their kin. Mother trees colonize their kin with bigger mycorrhizal networks. They send them more carbon below ground. They even reduce their own root competition to make elbow room for their kids. When mother trees are injured or dying, they also send messages, wisdom, onto the next generation of seedlings. So we've used isotope tracing to trace carbon moving from an injured mother tree down her trunk into the mycorrhizal network and into her neighboring seedlings. Not only carbon, but also defense signals. And these 2 compounds have increased the resistance of those seedlings to future stresses. So trees talk.
You might be surprised to hear that forest area has been increasing in many parts of the world. But, and it's a big but, the world is also struggling to cope with the damaging effects that cutting down forests is having on our environment. So what's going on? Scientific opinion is divided on whether forest area worldwide has increased in recent decades. What is clear is that there are big differences between regions. This map shows where tree cover has gone up in green and where it's gone down in red between 1982 and 2016. You can see that there were big losses in tropical areas such as the Amazon and rainforests in Africa and Southeast Asia, often caused by logging or deforestation to make space for agriculture and farming. But many other regions saw forest gains. The biggest were in Europe, China and the US, and much of this was due to human activity such as planting trees. This may all sound quite promising, but growing new forests isn't an easy fix solution to the harmful consequences of deforestation. To understand why, keep in mind the wide variety of forests that exist around the world. A rainforest in Indonesia, for example, differs from a forest in Northern Europe in many ways, such as biodiversity, tree density, and the capacity to store carbon dioxide, which causes global warming. Tropical forests store much more carbon per hectare than other types of forests. Tropical forests are also among the world's most biodiverse ecosystems, playing host to many endangered species of animals and plants. But it's in these rich tropical regions where deforestation continues to be most severe. And the damage done by cutting down these natural forests cannot simply be compensated for by growing new ones. Still, reforestation is generally seen as beneficial and an important part of tackling climate change. But in some cases, planting trees can actually do more harm than good. For example, planting trees where there were no forests to begin with, such as grasslands or peatlands, can damage existing ecosystems. Also, planting the wrong type of trees can have unforeseen consequences. Take China, which has taken a lead in planting new trees. A scheme that started in the 1970s has led to billions of trees being planted in the dry north of the country to stop desert spreading. However, some of the tree species used early on were not well suited to the local soil and climate and led to water shortages and trees dying through a lack of water. Experts say that reforestation has the greatest chance of success if it is sensitive to local environments and done in areas which naturally support forests. So, while international efforts to reforest the planet are generally a good thing, it's important to keep in mind that ecosystems are complex and that it matters where and how new forests are grown. Crucially, the damage caused by cutting down natural forests, especially in the most biodiverse regions of the world, cannot simply be outweighed by growing new ones.
This is Life Science Disciplinary Core Idea 2A. It's on interdependent relationships in ecosystems. So how do we get students to that level of understanding? Well, we start at the lower elementary grades by talking about animals and plants. And so what do animals like this meerkat require to survive? Well, they feed on insects, they feed on pretty much anything that they can find. So they need food, they need water, they need shelter, a place to live, and they're going to live underground. And then they need a suitable temperature, so it's not too hot and it's not too cold. But they really rely on plants. Even though they're eating a lot of animals, those animals are eating plants. And so animals are beholden to plants for food, also for shelter a lot of the time. And so what do plants need then? Plants require air, water, minerals that they're taking in through their roots, and they also require material from the air like carbon dioxide. But the big thing that I'm missing is they require light. How are they different than animals? Make sure your students understand that they can create their own food through photosynthesis. And animals have to either eat plants or things that eat plants. Now, plants don't have it all their own way. They can't move, and so they rely on animals to pollinate or to move their pollen around. And each of these plants are evolved to their specific environment, just like animals. And so a cactus is going to have different water requirements, obviously, than a lily pad. But they all do well where they live. As we move up in elementary, we should start to talk about levels of feeding and then food webs. And so the idea of what a producer is pretty important. A producer is going to be an organism that can produce their own food. And so plants are that. But there are other things like in the oceans, phytoplankton are really important producers on our planet. So they're producing food, and then that food is consumed. So consumers eat producers or eat things that eat producers. So as we move up, this would be a primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer. That means that they're eating things that eat plants or eating plants themselves. Now, those aren't the only two groups, producers and consumers, because when we die, we have to move the material back into the ecosystem again, and we do that using decomposers. And so worms or mushrooms and funguses are very important decomposers, and so are bacteria. And so we should really introduce the idea of a food web at this point. A food web is going to show how matter and energy moves in an ecosystem. And so, for example, this beetle is feeding on a tree, but it's eaten by a frog, which is eaten by a snake, which is eaten by a coyote. And so it's important that they understand where the arrow is moving and what it represents. It represents the movement of energy and matter. Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and this is Environmental Science Video 8. It's on energy flow in ecosystems. In the last video, we talked about the importance of producers producing food that's consumed by consumers, but we didn't talk about where that energy comes from. What's the major energy source on our planet? It's going to be the sun. And this model also doesn't show that we're losing energy to heat at each step along the way. And so a better model is an ecological pyramid that looks like this. And so the producers on our planet produce food, make energy usable. Where did that energy originally come from? It came from either the sun or chemicals. And so all plants do photosynthesis, and so they're taking energy from the sun and putting it into the energy of the bonds of the food. Now, some chemosynthetic bacteria can do the same thing with chemicals like hydrogen sulfide. They're making that energy usable. Now, once they've made that energy usable, they can respire it, and so can all the consumers that sit above or below them on this trophic levels. Now, we measure the amount of energy that's converted through productivity in one of two ways, either gross primary productivity or net primary productivity. Gross is the overall amount of energy converted, and net is just how much the plant gets after it used some of the energy for respiration. Now, each of the levels within this food chain is going to be a trophic level, and we're losing energy along the way, and so a good way to measure this is using an ecological pyramid. We can measure the efficiency, in other words, how much energy makes it to the next level. We can measure the energy to each level, or we could measure the biomass. How much living material do we have? And so energetics is the study of how energy gets from something like the sun into organisms. What's the most important first step is going to be photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide in the air, water, and the energy in sunlight, and we convert that into oxygen and glucose. If you haven't memorized the equation for photosynthesis, now is the time to do it. You should know what's going into the reaction and what's coming out of the reaction. And why that's important is we can simply turn the arrow around, and now we have the equation for cellular respiration. So that's what you're doing. You're taking in the oxygen that's produced by plants, taking in the sugar, and you're converting that into carbon dioxide and water. The nice thing is that this can be recycled again back into plants. And so this is really how we take energy, put it in plants, store it in the food, and so we can utilize it as well. Now, one major misconception is that plants are doing respiration as well. They're making the sugar for themselves to release that energy. Now, something very similar to photosynthesis is called chemosynthesis. And so if we look down deep in the oceans at these hydrothermal vents, we're producing not only heat, but we're producing a chemical, hydrogen sulfide. Also, methane can be used this way. And so certain chemosynthetic bacteria, look how similar this is to photosynthesis, can use the energy in the bonds of the hydrogen sulfide to make glucose. They release water and then sulfur. And so the equation looks very similar to photosynthesis. Now, what happens is things living around the chemosynthetic bacteria can take in that glucose, and they can use oxygen to do cellular respiration. And so we have a totally different system. It's built on the energy inside the chemicals. So no matter where the energy comes from, we can measure the amount that gets into the producers using productivity. Now, the bad news is that hardly any of that energy actually gets into the plant. 99% is going to move through it, bounce off of it. The plant doesn't get it. Only 1% actually goes into the producer, and we call that the gross primary productivity. It's the amount of energy that the plant actually gets. Now, what's the plant going to do? It has to survive. And so it's doing respiration. That's where most of the energy goes. And a small percent of it goes to what's called the net primary productivity. That's the amount that the plant gets if we subtract the amount that it used for respiration. So the bad news, not much energy goes into the producers. What's the good news? There's so much energy contained within the sun. If we look at the productivity on our planet, we could compare different terrestrial and aquatic biomes all the way from the tropical rainforest, which has high productivity. We're measuring that as the amount of material per meter squared per year, all the way down to something like a desert. It's not very productive at all. What's interesting is cultivated land actually doesn't produce that much. We could compare that to aquatic systems like coral reefs are incredibly productive. We could even look at how it changes over time. So this is net primary productivity. So this is terrestrial on land. And watch what happens as it changes over an 11-year period of time. You can see it's just moving back and forth. It's moving from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. You can see there's no production in areas where we have massive deserts. But what's causing that change is simply going to be the seasons. During the summer, we're going to have way more production where there's way more sunlight. And so an accurate model of measuring how energy is used is an ecological pyramid like this. And so what we're really looking at here is the net primary productivity, the amount at this level. And so if we start here with the producers, let's say that that small percent is actually 100%. What percent goes to the next level? Well, we're losing energy at each level. And that's because the organism has to survive. It does respiration. And so we're losing heat at each level. And so in general, of that 100% that the producers get, only 10% goes to the next level. What percent of this goes to the next level? 10% of that. So now we're down to 1%. And what about the next level? 10% of that. And so we're losing a huge amount of energy at each step along the way. And that's going to be why we have way less tertiary consumers than we're going to have producers in an area. Good way to study this is using an energy pyramid. And let's look at an actual energy pyramid from Silver Springs, Florida. What we're looking at here is the amount of energy. They're measuring it in kilocalories per meter squared per year. And so it's 20,000 kilocalories. Now, where's the energy found? Just looking at this picture, it's going to be, for the most part, in these trees. What amount makes it to the next level to the consumers? Well, when they studied it, it was this amount. So what's the ecological efficiency? What amount made it to the next level? Well, you could just take this and divide it by that. And we could find that 16% moved to the next level. We could look at the secondary consumers. You can see it's around 10% there. And we could look at the tertiary consumers, and you can see that it's around 5%. And so ecological efficiency is going to be somewhere between 5 and 20%, depending on how efficient that ecosystem is. Now, what are we really missing on this energy diagram are the decomposers. They're going to make use of a lot of that energy as well. Another way to measure it is biomass, just how much material is made. What's different here is that we don't measure it over a given period of time. We measure what's called standing crop. It's the amount that's there at one point in time. But you can see the same thing occurs. If we're looking at a Wisconsin lake or a field or a coral reef, the amount of biomass that we have at the producer level is going to be way more than we have at the levels above it.
In the first documentary, it was shown that plants reproduce vibrations which resemble a form of communication. Although the work by Cleve Baxter in the 1960s proved this fact, until now the function of these vibrations was unknown. As long as there is indiscriminate destruction of natural soil composition and resources, we may be hastening the loss of a web of communication vital to all living beings. More than 70% of the total information exchanged in the earth may be happening inside fertile topsoil. We can liken this to a universal consciousness occurring within these soils, connecting the consciousness of living forms on and within natural soil. The discoveries about plant vibrations have not significantly changed public thinking. The fact that these forces are hidden within nature and not readily observable has led to further questions. If we use the resources of nature to produce our cures from plants and roots, should this not make us aware of the destruction of natural environments and the loss to us of these unique resources? Why have some of us become distant and unbalanced compared to the rest of the natural environment? In this phase of evolution, we are able to recognize that we share an universal consciousness. It is therefore vital for the future understanding that nature is able to continue having its invisible but indispensable communication. The benefits are vital to both the planet and consequently our health.